Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Creating an Inclusive Workplace for Disabled Faculty and Professionals. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined in listen-only mode, meaning that your line has been muted, but you'll find other ways to communicate with us in the control panel. You can communicate with us and other attendees via the chat pane. You can post questions for the presenters at any time during the presentation by typing in the questions pane. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Kim M. Thompson, Associate Professor, the University of South Carolina, and Paul T. Yeager, Professor, Diversity and Inclusion Officer, and Co-Director of the College of Information Studies MLIS program, Co-Director of the Information Policy and Access Center at the University of Maryland. So I'll turn things over to Drs. Thompson and Yeager.
Hello. So hopefully the sound is good and the video is good. Hopefully you should all see a slide that says creating an inclusive workplace. Paul's gonna start and then I'll come in and then we'll both talk a bit and we'll end at 12:45 for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you. So as a starting point, when we're talking about disability, oftentimes it's almost the forgotten gigantic portion of our population. A lot of times people talk about diversity and they don't even think about disability as part of that. But when you talk about minority populations in the United States and in many, many other countries, disability is actually the largest minority group. And so we're not talking about a small number of people here. We're talking about almost 1/5 of the US population. The United States has been the international leader on creating civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act from 1990 is sort of the standard template for disability rights laws around the world. Most other countries modeled their disability rights laws on the ADA after it was created here. And this was the first comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities. In the United States, there were several smaller pieces, like the Architectural Barriers Act, which tried to eliminate inaccessible building entrances and navigation, and what's now known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which tried to open up public schooling to people with disabilities. So there were a number in the 70s that predated the ADA, but this was the first comprehensive statement that people with disabilities had civil rights, were equal human beings under the law. And the hope with the ADA was that it would change employment, or generally unemployment, issues with disabilities. And the amazing thing is that did not really happen. So in the United States, and this is worth pointing out, the US is generally one of the better countries in the world in terms of participation of disabled people in the workforce. Generally speaking, it's about 1/4 of people with disabilities have like full-time employment, or at least consistent employment. Yet the vast majority of them who don't have jobs want to work. And so the low levels of employment lead to very high levels of factors that are very negative socially. And a lot of categories that you do not want to be a part of a population statistically that wins the category, people with disabilities run the table on a whole bunch of really bad ones: living in poverty, not graduating from high school, not graduating from college, lacking home internet access. The lack of equitable participation in the workforce for disabled people really leads to a whole lot of very significant negative social things collectively that works against people with disabilities individually and as a entire population of people. And for those of you who have maybe been mildly paying attention to anything over the past few years, you might have also noticed that the social societal environment has become more difficult for just being a person with a disability, and it has nothing to do with law. The language and rhetoric of the presidential administration, many of the key members of the administration, people who are getting appointed to judgeships by the administration, strongly negative in terms of disability and in terms of disability rights in general. And so one of the people who's now on the Supreme Court, one of their big things prior to being put on the Supreme Court was arguing that disability rights laws should be interpreted as narrowly as possible. The Secretary of Education is on record as saying that states should not have to allow students with disabilities into public school. A lot of resources have been taken down from various agencies to support people with disabilities. And of course, yeah, the president has an odd habit of mocking disability, being videoed doing it and then claiming he didn't. So, you know, it's never been a great time to be a person with disability, but it's a really awkward time now on top of all the other normal problems. But one of the really cool things that a lot of people in our field don't know but should is that we've done a lot more for a lot longer than most other fields when you talk about disability. So 150, 200 years ago, having a disability usually excluded you from being a normal functioning community member in every way possible. A lot of municipalities in the US and in a lot of other places had what are collectively known in hindsight as ugly laws, which was if you were not normal, if you were aesthetically displeasing. They were phrased in a number of ways, but the idea was if you were physically different, if you were cognitively different, you weren't supposed to be seen outside. These were very common laws in the 1800s. And going directly against that, as the public library movement took off, they openly welcomed people with disabilities from the beginning. In some places that have older public libraries, they have close to 200 years of uninterrupted history of having special collections, special materials for people with different print disabilities. And then special libraries specifically for people with disabilities, in some cases, are over 100 years old. And the national system for supporting print need, you know, different collections for different materials in different formats, different print needs, that as a national thing that is over 100 years old here. Libraries have treated people with disabilities as people collectively much better, much longer than any other social institution. And this should be an enormous point of pride in our field, and it's unfortunately not as well known as it should be. So because of the long history, because of the fact that our institutions are geared towards providing materials in many different ways, to helping people in many different ways, to being welcoming and inclusive, there is a stronger connection between disabled people and our institutions and our field than a lot of other careers and kinds of institutions. This isn't a field-wide thing, but just, you know, an interesting way of illustrating this. At the University of Maryland, we regularly do climate assessment studies of who's in our college and who's in our programs. As long as we've been doing them here, in our MLIS program, which has 350-ish students at the moment, so it's, you know, a decent number of people, we run in the high teens on average every year of people in the program with disabilities. So we're just a little bit under the national average of what the percentage of disabled people in the overall population is. But compared to the rest of higher education, master's programs, people with disabilities, you're talking very, very low single-digit percentages normally. So I don't know what it is field-wide in other MLIS programs, but in ours, that connection between these institutions are welcoming and inclusive, this career is welcoming and inclusive, is very much being made by the students who come to our program.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. So we're switching over to Kim, and so I am going to take this conversation. We're just going to take it over to the little island at the bottom of the map here, Australia. So I'm at the University of South Carolina now, but I've just come from working in Australia and am working on some work in this area with some colleagues over there. And so just wanted to give you a little bit of a not quite global, but just another country perspective. So Paul's statistic was that 19% of the US population is disabled. So in Australia, it's similar, 18.3%. And so in the US, for comparison, we had the Hispanic Latinx ethnic community, which is the next largest minority. In Australia, the next largest minority is the Irish ancestry. And I think next is Wales or Scottish, and then so it's so Paul and I were talking about how diversity is different depending on your context. And so in the Australian context, the disabled population is a very significant population. And worldwide, the disabled population is estimated at about 15%, which is a tricky estimation because a lot of countries don't keep any data. And in Australia, Paul said in 1990 that ADA, and in Australia the Disability Discrimination Act followed that a couple years later. And similar to the ADA, it prohibits discrimination based on grounds of disability for employment, education, access to premises, access to goods, services, and facilities. So quite similar to the ADA. Just some of the details of that are that not only should people be able to access it, but they shouldn't be relegated to the less pleasant areas of a building or of a floor when you go to see a movie, or not segregated, and so they're the same kind of detail that we have in the ADA in the United States. Also, the equal employment opportunity legislation in Australia is fairly similar. So we have a fairly similar policy and culture in Australia to what we have in the United States. It's unlawful to disadvantage employees and job seekers in any way because of their physical or mental disability. So similar to the US, a third of the disabled population in Australia work part-time and want to work more hours. So in Australia, the business.gov.au website has a lot of really very useful resources about disability support. They have some statistics such as, did you know that people with disability make up 10% of the Australian workforce? They also have some information about some of the pros to hiring disabled people, and so take fewer days off, less sick leave, fewer compensation incidents and accidents, build strong relationships with customers. So just some of the positive. I did try to find the primary resources for these statistics that they had. They don't cite them, and I saw this on many different websites, but I couldn't find the actual data. I'm guessing it's from their labor statistics that they collect every year. Another bit of information they provided is that most people with a disability won't need changes to the workplace, but to talk to your employee. So you've hired the person, and so then talking with this person and saying, what modification do you need in the physical environment? Do you need accessible car parking, et cetera? So just finding out exactly what is needed. Just non-disabled employees benefit from the same accommodation that is provided. Accommodations are a source of improved work practices, and the more research that I've done in this area, and the more I've read, and the more empirical data we have, the more that I'm seeing that this is very much the case. Accommodation creates and provides better tools to do the job, which are better for everyone doing the job, and thinking of different, smarter ways to work, which benefits everyone. So my colleagues Rebecca Moore and Asim Qayyum at Charles Sturt University and I collected data about library jobs in Australia. And we were wondering, are library job ads inviting disabled LIS graduates to apply? So Paul just told you about how, at least in his program, there's a high number of people with disabilities. And so inviting disabled, are the jobs out there inviting these disabled graduates that we have? And are library job ads discouraging? Are they inviting or are they discouraging disabled LIS grads from applying? So I'll just talk a little bit about that. So just a little bit about the data. So we just looked at a fortnight's worth of job ads, and and Australia is a much smaller population, 25 million people compared to over 300 million in the US. And so in a fortnight worth of job ads, that was about 100 ads. Yeah, Paul's raising his hand.
What's a fortnight? People might be wondering that.
Sorry. Fortnight is 2 weeks. So we looked at 2 weeks worth of job ads that went up for 2 weeks. This is just a pilot study just to see, what could we see. So we found about 100 ads. We analyzed for wording, accommodation, disability, medical examinations, and EEO statements. So the findings were that 41, so it's not quite 100, but if you need to think of percentages, so it's 41 out of 96. Had wording about hiring diverse populations, which was good. Mostly it was EEO or equal opportunity employment wording. So for example, organization X has is an equal opportunity employer committed to diversity, right? So they stated that specifically. So the other, what would that be, 55 jobs didn't have any wording about that. They just said, this is what we're looking for, blah, blah, blah. And so 41 said, and we're not only looking for those things, but we're an equal opportunity employer. So then 8 of those ads spelled out diversity as seeking to hire women and or linguistically diverse applicants, right? So when they were talking about diversity, for 8 of those, that specifically is the diversity they were looking for, was women and culturally and linguistically diverse applicants. The majority of the 96 ads had neutral language, so strong communication skills, health science degree, just very laid out exactly what the jobs were and what was needed for that job, just simply the job description. 8 of the ads specifically named disability as one of their values of diversity inclusion. So city name accepts applicants from a diverse range of backgrounds. Applicants from the following groups are encouraged to apply: Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people living with disability, and people who speak a first language other than English, right? So, so 8 of the ads specifically mention people living with a disability in some way. And then another of those, 4 of those ads, so half of them, specifically described interest in providing reasonable accommodation for interview or selection process if needed. So, for example, here, this organization, we embrace differences in gender, age, ethnicity, race, cultural background, and disability, religion, and sexual orientation. So they're kind of their EEO statement. And then they say, we know diversity and inclusion helps us to attract, recruit, engage, and retain a team of talented people. So kind of the why, which I really liked. And then they specifically say, if you require specific support to apply for this position, please advise the recruiting manager whose contact details are listed in the advertisement. We will work with you to identify the best way to assist you. So they specifically noted what accommodation they would be happy to provide. And then 3 of the ads, we're kind of on the other side. So for those ads, we're very specific about what they did offer. 3 ads that did not talk about diversity actually said that they also would require a pre-employment medical, which we thought was wording that could make someone with disability say, okay, wait, I'm just going to think twice about this job because I don't know how I'm going to do on this medical, just as anybody might say, right? And one actually specifically noted that a medical assessment would be used in order to determine the applicant's fitness to carry out duties, which are listed in the ads as leadership, ability to work in a busy organization, strong previous experience, communication and problem solving skills, and research skills. And so, you know, as we're analyzing the content here, we didn't really see how a medical exam was needed to assess these skills that were needed for the job. And they, in no way did they specify that this person would need to be lifting 50 pounds or that they, you know, are carrying small children or anything. It was just, it just didn't seem relevant to the position. And so we assessed that this would be quite unfriendly to someone with a disability trying to apply for this job. So there are logistical changes to a disabled job seeker that challenges to a disabled job seeker that can really be daunting and really prevent someone from wanting to even apply for a position that may, in one part of it, be saying, you know, we welcome diversity, but then on the other hand saying, and we want medical exams. Maybe the medical exam is just a drug test, but what does that drug test, what are they looking for? Could my medication for depression, could my medication for pain prevent me from getting this job? Do I even want to go through the embarrassment of taking the test and having to tell me that they don't want me because I'm on pain medication? And so, so there were definitely some challenges that we saw there that should be addressed in the future in our field. So then bringing it back to the global, Paul and I wanted to just talk for a little bit about job ads, about interviewing, about the whole process, and what are some issues about job ads that can, so the differences between legally what you can ask and what is inviting when you ask. So just from the data that we've looked at, so we are doing a second round of data right now. We just finished a second round for the year, and we're seeing pretty much the same as we saw last year. Wording about, some of them talking about specifically wording about, you know, we will have a medical exam. They don't really seem terribly tied to the job description that they've provided. And so there is some of that negative wording in there. So in the write-ups and that we'll be doing, we will focus on that and try to get some information about some best practices in writing job ads that are inviting. Paul, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, it's a, you know, you're using Australia as an example, but it's really important to emphasize that this is very much a global problem with job ads. Is so often diversity language clearly doesn't include disability, and then it can be, you know, the physical test language is one of those things that is a continuity as well. That's not just Australian, the wording maybe, but so when you're looking at job ads, just, well, if you have any reason to be in the near future, you know, paying attention to just the language, the wording, the implications of what is in there, with the lens of how would I read this if I had a disability. They can read very differently no matter where you are. And, you know, oftentimes those indicators, like you must be able to, and then some physical something listed that then has nothing to do with the position, whether or not it's intentional by the person writing it, that those can be feel like they're immediately trying to exclude. Like if you're applying to be a cataloger, why do you need to be able to carry 50 pounds? Or, you know, I guess if you're cataloging very heavy books, but otherwise. Right.
And that's a good point, Paul. And I attended a diversity and job ads session that they had at the University of South Carolina. And one thing we talked about is that the legal department said that when you have, this is required for the job, and then we see this often, and we saw this in quite a few of the job ads that we've been looking at, that they'll have, this is required, and they'll say this is desired. Yeah. And they said if that's desired, it needs to go under required. If it's required, if it's not, leave it off. Like don't put that desired in there if it's not required for the job. Just focus on what is required and leave it at that, and then let the applicant inform you on how great they are for this position. Just do interviews with that criteria in mind. And so legally, that's also the best idea. So we just want to talk a bit about interviewing with a disability as well. And I know that Paul has some interesting stories here.
Yeah. So obviously, anybody, when you're applying for jobs, when you get offers of interviews, it's a scary process for most of us. You know, I'm sure for the most egomaniacal, it's exciting, but you know, everyone else is nervous, and it's got a whole bunch of extra challenges if you have a disability. Now, one of the things that's pretty standard for disability rights laws, US, Australia, a lot of places that follow the ADA model, is employers can't ask people if they have a disability legally as part of the job process. And there are obviously very clear reasons for that. But that then puts someone with an obvious disability in the position of, how do I explain this? Do I explain this? Should we all pretend that this isn't here? And all of the questions that come with, well, if I say something, what are the risks? If I don't say something, what are the risks? When I fall off the curb, will it just make it worse? And so then all of the interactions, if you know, if we're talking an academic library context and it's a multi-day interview, then you navigate dinners and you navigate breakfasts, and you know, but even if it's just a couple-hour interview, you're still in the position of getting around an unfamiliar environment, or you know, if you want to look at it in the most meta sense, getting to an unfamiliar environment. You know, goodness knows if having to take an aeroplane is involved, that can make it super exciting if you have quite a few different physical disabilities. So this process is laden with questions that people with disabilities have to navigate that other job seekers do not. You know, even from the basic, if it's a position where they're getting references, whether letters or calling people, before you even go on the market, how do you talk to your references about how you want them to handle your disability? When I was job seeking, I didn't think about that for, you know, when looking for faculty positions, and so I had some of my references decided not to talk about it. Some decided to highlight it. Apparently, one of them did the whole "he's so inspirational" thing, which you know, and so I didn't realize this, and then, but like before I got to campus interviews, there was all this baggage that had been created. So I had to be inspiring, apparently, and so this is, you know, it's a very, very extra complicated process with a disability oftentimes. About 12 years ago, the Association for Higher Education and Disability had put out a book that I got to contribute to that was actually devoted to disability issues in the hiring process. And it was focused on higher ed jobs. So, you know, in this context, academic libraries would fall into it, but, you know, it's just generally, or LIS faculty would fall into it. But I wrote a chapter with a colleague who sadly is no longer around, but where we interviewed a whole bunch of people who had disabilities, talking about what the interviewing, a job, you know, filling out job applications, doing interviews, going to interviews, what the process was like in terms of things they didn't expect. And it was just this amazing catalog of even someone with a disability you would not have thought of. And so the key thing that we pulled away from all of these stories was simply, in a lot of cases, the presence of disability, because the interviewers are not comfortable with it, was short-circuiting the job process. One person told us about how this was a woman who already had her PhD in hand. when she was on the job market. And one of the places she went to, after she'd been there a while, one of the people on the hiring committee asked her if she was literate. And this was not something that she had expected, with good reason. You know, a PhD sort of indicates. And so they asked her if she could, you know, just write an essay for them to prove that she actually knew how to write. And she started doing this, and some senior administrator interceded and basically like threw the hiring committee out while she was sitting there trying to write a, you know, a 5th grade essay to prove that she could write. And this administrator offered her the job on the spot, presumably to avoid the obvious problems that the hiring committee had created. And smartly, this woman said, "I would just like to leave now." You know, so that's a really extreme example, but the unfamiliarity, which is so often present in work environments with disabilities, really can deeply affect job seeking, interviewing, getting hired with disability. You know, more common things are like, oh, well, I have to get to this place I've never gotten to, and I have to get, you know, they give me, oh, I'm in room whatever on the 3rd floor, be there at 11, and then how do you deal with, say, challenges of an unfamiliar building or traveling to an unfamiliar place, and they're overcomable, but they put you at, you know, you're already psychologically worried about that. Those are the much more mundane than, say, literacy tests, but it's just the entire process of job seeking when you have a disability, every little bit of it has the potential to be much more complicated simply because of the social garbage that goes with disability.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, you brought up some really good points that make me think about, so we were talking earlier about the statistics in our field. We have looked for, can we say how many academics live with a disability? And we can't, because some people choose to disclose, some people do not. And so you don't ever want to force someone to have to disclose to meet your needs for your schedule and for your building and things like that for the interview. And so again, this is another point where making it better for accommodation makes it better for everyone, because think of how exhausting interviews are. When you go for a job interview, you're already nervous, and if there is a meal involved or not, you're meeting with several people, and just getting from one place to the other in a new environment, you don't know where you're going. And just maybe if we can just think of a more humane interview process for everyone, we'll probably be solving a lot of the problems that we have for interviewing someone with a disability, right? So we'll just move on to the next slide, which is just a little bit turning to the other side. So many people entering the workforce do so with limited familiarity of working with disabled people, or even a basic etiquette related to disability. And there are resources that are available online. They're actually the National Institution for Journalism or something like that has what things to keep in mind when you're doing an interview with somebody, a disabled person, which are lovely as well. And things like, you know, if someone's in a wheelchair, that is part of their body. You don't like pat the wheelchair or grab the wheelchair and start pushing them, right? And so just things that if you are feeling like I don't know exactly what to do, there are lots of wonderful resources available for how to interact. If you're talking with someone who has an interpreter or a person who's signing, you still look at and talk to the person you're talking to, not to the person who's signing. And Paul's laughing because he's like, of course. But for a lot of people, like, you just, you know, if you're feeling awkward, if you feel like you don't exactly know what to do, there are resources that can give you some etiquette. And if you are working, and so, you know, and we don't know exactly who all of the participants are in this session, but if you are educators in LIS, talking about these issues with students would be very, very useful, because a lot of our students are directors. Some of them will be directors. Some are people who are affected by this. And so So this is a good conversation to have with all of our students to talk about some of these issues, I'd say.
Yeah, and I'm actually laughing because as you're running through the examples, I think of actual lived things that are like far sillier than what you know, the sort of basic lack of treating someone with respect. But you know, the list of those things is just, it's hilarious. I mean, you know, if someone can't see, you don't need to speak louder to them, which that one I've always enjoyed. But this is also something where if someone is open about a disability, that is an opportunity then to learn from them, not in a like totally oppressive way, like you represent all people with disabilities, but in a sense like, how do you want us to handle this? One of my jobs on this campus is I co-run a thing called the President's Commission on Disability Issues, which is like the main advocacy body for disability on campus. So we get a lot of questions from any part of campus about how to handle things. And in one case, there was a unit where the director was involved in an accident and came back as a wheelchair user. And his staff was asking questions like, how do we deal with him now? And the answer to every question was, have you asked him? No. Well, maybe you should. And you know, so if this is part of who someone openly is, you can ask, how would you like us to do this? And in most cases, they're going to be really grateful for you treating them as a human being.
Thank you. And so we have one more slide here that just, and Paul said, you can tell this is an Australian who said this. So MP in Australia said, impairments are a fact of life. They arrive at birth through life's genetic lottery. They take hold of us in a car ride or a swim in the surf that goes devastatingly wrong. They slowly permeate us as we grow old. In a sense, impairments are not what disable people. What disables people is society's attitude toward the impairment. And I know, you know, maybe we should have started talking about this at the beginning, but that the idea of disability is not a person's physical limitations, it's how society treats that individual, right? And so in anything, everybody wants to be respected. Everyone wants to feel treated and talked to as a person who's, you know, on equal footing, equally intelligent, equally capable, and having people not ask questions and just assume or just not talk about things, I think can be a very awkward and unequal because it's, you know, you're not bringing that person into the conversation.
Yeah. And the fact that disability is a social construct, it's also worth remembering that society decides what is a disability. You know, a lot of unique characteristics are labeled not, you know, if somebody has naturally blonde hair, they're about 1% of the world's population. That's not generally seen as a disability. If someone can throw a little squishy spear 100 miles an hour, it's a rarity, but instead of being labeled disabled, you get $100 million contract to throw the little squishy ball at someone holding a piece of wood, at least in the United States. So, you know, there's a lot of things that are differences that society says, meh, or hey, have a wheelbarrow full of money. But what is a disability? Society also selects that. And, you know, in most cases, what's disability now is what was disability 500 years ago. You know, these are venerable social constructions, but they are social constructions and decisions that societies collectively make to say, we should isolate that person, or we should not, you know, not treat them equally. Whether or not that's spoken, the decision to see something as disabling has become de facto, you know, an exclusionary device. But it is, at its origin, a society is making a choice.
Mm-hmm. And Paul, this also reminded me that we didn't mention it specifically, but that with disability as well, we are talking about visible as well as invisible disabilities. Mm-hmm. So what am I trying to say? You may not be able to see a disability, right? And you may not even know this person has a disability because they act just as though they don't. You know, they perform at in a way that you would not have guessed, but it doesn't mean that they don't need consideration still, you know? That makes sense?
Yes, and in a lot of places now, neurodiversity, autism, learning disabilities, that kinds of thing, are actually the most common types of disability. I mean, we've been talking about this in sort of like not very specific examples with disabilities, but the invisible disabilities thing is really an important point to highlight, since in a lot of cases, those will be less obvious in job interviews, but they may be a very big part of working with someone. And so that awareness, that humaneness, you know, it really does extend across disability. You know, this is a space where, you know, it may be something that becomes more obvious over time. Someone's at an organization, but it's no less important.
So we do want to take questions, and so I think it's about time for question time. And I think that we'll turn the time over to Clayton to manage that for us. Oh, we may need to do something to give her access.
Thank you, everyone. This was just wonderful. We're going to give everyone just a few moments to type any questions that you may have into the chat box. And thank you, Drs. Thompson and Yeager, for a wonderful presentation. I was captivated by so many of the elements in your presentation today, one of them being awareness, and the other being social constructions. And in both of those, we have an ability to overcome barriers, because those are things that obviously by being here today, we care about awareness, and we know that through awareness, we can play a role in deconstructing values that have been very disabling to populations that just happen to have different lived experiences and challenges. One of the things that I often like to say is, how do our differences make us specially able? And I wonder, as we're thinking about this as an LIS curriculum issue and as something in our libraries today, could you share with us some best practices for wording that would be inviting, language and practices that would be inviting during an interview process, in a job ad in and of itself?
It's a good question, Clayton. So I think, here, I'll go back to the, oops, if I can. I'll go back to the slide that looked about just an example. So the wording that I hope is up on your screens there. If you require specific support to apply for this position, please advise the recruiting manager whose contact details are listed in the advertisement. We will work with you to identify the best way to assist you. So I thought that was really lovely wording. It's so first you say we invite disability. This is why it's important to us, the second sentence, and then this is specifically what we're going to do to ensure that this is a pleasant experience for all of us, right? And so I really like that example. Honestly, of the job ads that we saw, this was the only one who even had, four had specific interest, but this is the one that had the best, I thought, the best wording. And so then again, like I said, we just collected another month's worth of data in Australia, and we'll start looking at it and see if there are more really good examples for that. Paul, do you have any thoughts? Interviews?
I think the interview becomes so much more contextual, because the job ad is written broadly, but then it's dependent on the person and the difference, if there is one, and if they disclose it, or if it's obvious and not. So it's less beyond the act like a decent human being.
Yeah, which is good for everybody. Again, like everybody, it's just good for everyone. So yeah. Does that answer your question, Clayton? Were there two parts?
Yeah. Very helpful. Very helpful. With regard to some of the concerns that have been voiced about hiring people with disabilities, what advice would you give to both parties in terms of those hiring and those on the job market with regard to some of these apprehensions?
So I don't know the perfect answer to that, but I do know, as you know, I've been in the literature quite a bit lately, and one thing that I've seen from literature outside of our field, like looking at Department of Labor information in Australia and here, and I would say that, so disclosure is completely up to the individual, and I know that with my students. So, and I teach at USC, and sometimes I'll have a student who will say, "Look, I'm registered with this disability. I'm going to need a little more time on assignments," and they tell me at the beginning of the semester, and all semester I'm aware of that. They sometimes ask for extension, sometimes they don't. I have other students who, like right before an assignment is due, they say, "Oh, and by the way, I have this disability and I haven't registered, but could I get an extension?" And I'm happy to work with them with that, but it's a little bit more stress on me because I've planned how my time goes, and so having this unknown thing come up can be a bit stressful. So I think what I'm trying to say is that both sides, we need to think of the whole person, right? And so not only the organization needs to think of what every interviewee and every applicant needs, but also the applicants need to also think about who they're going to and what they're doing, and do they need to tell in order to get the accommodation they need? Like, why make it a worse experience than it has to be for you as well, right? And so saying, okay, you've put me on this flight and I'm going to have this layover in this place, just so you know, that's going to be a difficulty for me, and so I would prefer to have a direct flight, right? And so just communicating what you need. You may not even need to disclose the disability, but just communicating, look, that's not going to work, I'm going to need this, and being very specific and saying, no, like this needs to happen for me to come and take this interview. And so is that?
Yeah, absolutely. As a person with disability, the more you've thought through how you want it approached, how you want to talk about it, what you'll need, the sooner that you say these things, the fewer questions there are that are unanswered, and the more it can be, the interview, getting you set up in the job, the more you will be set up to succeed, the more you've thought this through, and the sooner you articulate what you want to articulate.
Yeah, and think of them as your team that's trying to make sure you succeed as just much as you want the organization to succeed, right? And so communication to make sure everybody knows what to do for the best result.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And here's a question from the field. Would you recommend actively seeking persons with disabilities on the faculty or as part of organizations? Reason being, with the best of intentions, the best person to advocate for and speak to the needs of certain disabilities is the person with the disability. For example, if you are not blind, you cannot fully appreciate the experiences of a blind person. So should organizations intentionally seek out persons with different disabilities, of course, qualified for the jobs?
Would you like me to, could you mind if I say something first?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've just been reading a book from the management business side of the world. And it was really interesting because I was reading about hiring. Like they were just talking about the whole business and management process. And one thing they said was when you're hiring for diversity, if you can, hire two, hire more than one, because the more you have, the more camaraderie there will be, the more they can inform, right? And the more you can diversify. And so if you're thinking, you know, oh, we need a diverse point of view, let's hire someone with a disability. No, let's hire two people with disabilities, right? Because everyone's gonna have different perspectives. And so, so the more diverse you can have, the better. But yes, I would say hiring someone with like targeting, and you can target with disabilities. So at the University of South Carolina job process that I went to, they were talking about diversity, and they said, somebody said, well, are we supposed to say on our job ad, we are only looking for African American women, or we are looking for a specific population? And the legal people said, what you do is you say, here's the ad, and then when you're looking through them, if you have two people and they're equally good, you're supposed to hire the one who's more diverse. Like that they're more good because they do bring diverse perspectives, and that is going to be a step up from just, you know, these two people are equal in this application.
There's also the fun of there's literature out there about in both studies of workforce and in studies of psychology. People with disabilities, by the fact that they have to navigate the world in a different way, and what that different way is going to be very different depending on the disability, there tends to be a set of mental skills that people with disabilities are better at than other folk because of having to be creative all the time, just getting through the day. So there are actually some very distinct advantages to hiring disabled people in terms of being more creative thinkers, being better at dealing with change, better at coming up with solutions to problems that are new problems that haven't been faced before. There's actually a lot of study. There's a whole list of things that disabled people tend to do better than any other people in employment settings, just because of having to see things metaphorically in a different way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And like we had on that previous slide from the Australian Labour business.gov.au, fewer sick days, you know, more longevity in a position, like a lot of perks for the organization as well.
Yeah, and I feel like just mentioning this here in terms, it's not completely related, but it's just sort of a fun thing to pick up from. I mentioned early on, at least in our MLIS program, we have a much higher than normal percentage of students have disabilities. Early on, the question of, you know, do people with disabilities get hired? Our students from the graduates from our program within 3 months, northward of 97% have a full-time job in the field. The ones who don't are getting another graduate degree. That's usually about it. So at least for our students, you know, if you figure we have 350 students, 18-ish% have a disability, you're talking about like, you know, 60, 70 people somewhere around there. And we don't have a 60 to 70 person gap in hiring of our graduates out of every bunch. And so these folks, our students with disabilities, are getting hired as much as all the other students, and they've got to be offering some advantages, you know, in terms of what they know and what they can do. So it's, you know, this is, whether or not you're seeking out intentionally looking for candidates with disabilities to fill positions, at least in our field, there's going to be a lot of folks with disabilities who are really good fits for your positions.
And we'll ask the audience one more time, an opportunity for additional questions.
I see that Catherine Opalenik also said, have individuals with disabilities been asked how they want the ad to be written? For example, ask the source, right? And absolutely, any diversity job ad that you're searching for diversity, it would be a very good practice to ask diverse individuals in your organization and talk about that with yeah, or out, you know, practitioners or yeah. The whole never about us without us idea, right? So, and even when making accommodation, again, not going, oh, I assume this is the accommodation they'll need because of this disability, but never, like always talking to the individual and saying, what accommodation do you want? Do you need?
Okay, well, thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. And thank you, Drs. Thompson and Yeager, for being with us. And to everyone in attendance today, please keep in mind that creating an inclusive workplace for disabled faculty and professionals will be posted in the Member Center of the ALICE website within 24 hours. And if there are any additional questions, or if we were unable to get to your question for some reason, please do contact our speakers directly. On behalf of ALICE and our presenters, thank you kindly for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Clayton.
Thank you.